I have to say today is fundamentally very simple. It's something I've said many times, including my acceptance speech when I was nominated as president and my inaugural speech when I became president. But it cannot be said too often or too firmly nor too strongly. As long as I am president, the government of the United States will continue throughout the world to enhance human rights.
The year is 1979 and America is in deep political and economic trouble. Double-digit inflation, high interest rates, and unemployment hover over Americans across the nation, and the cost of fuel has doubled. Political and military tensions are at an all-time high between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War, and after the Communist Soviets occupied Afghanistan in December, the United States decided to intervene. And when the 1980 Summer Olympics were set for the Soviet Union, the United States and 60 other nations decided not to participate as a form of protest over the invasion. America's decision to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics demonstrates the tension between the responsibility of the government to protest Soviet action and the rights of the athletes to compete in an event that serves as a symbol of international cooperation and peace. James Earl Carter, known as Jimmy Carter, became President of the United States in 1977. He created a new federal-level department during his term called the Department of Energy to deal with the oil crisis at the time. Carter's main focus in office was to repair the U.S. foreign policy, but in a diplomatic and peaceful way. He was successful through the Panama Canal Treaties, where he agreed on neutrality over control of the canal, as well as the Camp David Accords, where he acted as a mediator between Israel and Egypt. Carter believed that foreign affairs could be dealt with as peacefully and as diplomatically as possible. But an uprising in Iran tarnished Carter's previous record of political problem-solving. Left-wing extremists deposed the Shah in Iran, a centrist ruler who had ties with a string of U.S. administrations. Outraged over the Shah's political relations with the United States, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. embassy and take 52 Americans hostage. Carter reacted to the hostage crisis just as he did with other foreign policy issues, with ideas of peaceful negotiation. But Carter's way of attacking foreign policy shifted drastically after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan nearly a month later. He had always chastised governments around the world for not giving basic civil rights to their people, but as president, this event had pushed him to the breaking point. He then decided to go on an offensive and military approach. Carter imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and changed legislation in order to allow men under 19 in the United States to be drafted to the Army. More importantly, Carter campaigned to convince Americans to boycott the 1980 Olympiad that was to be held in the Soviet Union that following year.
The Soviet Union must realize that its continued aggressive actions will endanger both the participation of athletes and the travel to Moscow by spectators who would normally wish to attend the Olympic Games.
President Carter won a major victory today in his bid to boycott the Moscow Olympic Games because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Carter's plan to boycott the Olympics in Moscow got mixed reviews from the citizens of the United States. While he was coordinating with other countries to join in his efforts, many were outraged that Carter would use political reasons to strip the rights of athletes around the world. Reporters wrote of how boycotting the Olympics would not change the Soviets' minds about occupying Afghanistan, and many argued that the real victims of the boycott were the Olympic athletes who have been training their entire lives to compete in the greatest athletic competition that the world has ever known. A few years before the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, Americans were still skeptical about the Soviet Union hosting the coming Olympics. One article from the Christian Science Monitor in 1973 stated that the IOC must secure clear assurances that the 1980 Games will be held in a manner that will lessen, not heighten, the friction of peoples. One major reason for controversy was that allowing American athletes to compete in Moscow would not be safe. At the 1973 Universiade, the international sporting event for university athletes, the Soviet hosts allowed and even encouraged anti-Semitism, and native Jews who were courageous enough to cheer for Israeli teams during the event were either jailed or detained by Soviet officials. Some Americans, however, believed that boycotting the games would be a good thing. In a letter to the editor of the Washington Post, U.S. Representative Robert F. Drinan stated that, "Together we are sending a message to the Soviet people that the United States will honor its promises on human rights and refuse to acquiesce that becoming instruments in increased repression." Because Jimmy Carter's boycott would serve as a symbol of American protest against communist ideas, many Americans backed up the boycott. Others believed that by not attending the Olympics and convincing other countries to do so, the Soviets would not generate nearly as much revenue from the Games as they thought. Some just really wanted to stick it to the Soviets for all of their communistic wrongdoing. The public opinion, therefore, was greatly divided. One thing that these many American viewpoints had in common was that the boycott might stand as a symbol of American action against communist regime, but that it would also serve more as a slap on the wrist for previous actions than any sort of preventative method for future issues, including the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. One significant group of people who suffered from the boycott were the American athletes, who had been training for years, or even their entire lives, to compete in the 1980 Olympiad. Athletes train to compete in the Olympics every 4 years, not only to represent their country and participate in a sport for which they have a passion and talent, but also to compete against the best athletes around the world in the biggest competition of all. Not all athletes have the chance or ability to compete in the Olympiad more than one time, so for some athletes, the boycott was a major disappointment. Some athletes attempted to sue the ISOC for not letting them compete, but it was no use. Men and women that have been training their entire lives to the greatest athletic event in the world were crushed as they were restricted from the Games for political, symbolic reasons. Don Page, American runner ranking first in the world for the 800-meter dash, was one of these distraught athletes. Page confessed to CNN that, "To this day, I have never watched the Olympic 800 final. I made that promise to myself." In 1980, he ran the fastest time of the year for the 800 meter and was definitely a contender for the gold medal. The absence of so many athletes from the Games tested the Games' legitimacy and showed how the Olympic boycott not only impacted the lives of athletes that never competed, but also of those who did. Though many countries didn't attend, spirits at the opening ceremony were high and as lively as ever. It was not only until the Games officially began and medals were awarded when the legitimacy of the event was brought into question. Craig Beardsley, an American swimmer that was not allowed to compete in the 1980 Olympic Games because of the boycott, is another example of a major contender for the gold who was not given the chance to compete. Though Sergei Frenesco of the Soviet Union won the gold medal for the 200-meter butterfly, Beardsley set the world record for that same event merely 10 days after that first race had taken place. The Olympiad may have went on without many of its usual competitors, but the loss of many capable athletes serves as an example of how tainted the 1980 Olympic Games really were because of the boycott. The Soviet Union did not withdraw from Afghanistan, despite attempts of so many countries to protest the Moscow Games. In response to the boycott organized by Jimmy Carter and the United States Olympic Committee, the Soviet Union boycotted the following Olympiad in 1984 that took place in Los Angeles on the grounds that the American government could not guarantee the safety of their athletes there. As payback for the previous boycott, the Soviets organized 14 other countries to boycott the 1984 Olympiad with them, which resulted in yet another Olympic Games without full support and participation of the best athletes from around the world. Forcing politics into an event that was created to represent peace and cooperation between all nations through competition and sportsmanship was not the correct decision by the United States. Jimmy Carter and the USOC had the responsibility to take a stand against the Soviet Union, but not in such a way that stripped the rights of so many athletes to compete in the highest level of athletic competition that the world has ever known, especially because these attempts did not change anything for the Soviet Union in regard to their occupation of Afghanistan. From the point of view of the athletes, the United States took the responsibility to be the world's policeman too far. The right of the athletes to compete in a competition that serves as a symbol of peace and cooperation among nations is far more important than any act of symbolism that is driven by political unrest and conflict.